The high Victorian period throughout the second half of the 19th century really left its mark on Sydney in terms of grand and ornate architecture and stunning sandstone buildings, although many of them have been simply dwarfed by the ever-growing high-rise buildings and the cityscape, which has become very modern with glass and steel. But there they sit with lovely clock towers and very decorative facades. There are many types and grades of sandstone, which is the bedrock of this entire basin that Sydney sits on. But the building block of choice that will be used as the sandstone for most of the grand buildings we'll see today was quarried from a spot called Pyrmont. And if you were to head down to Darling Harbour, which is just behind Town Hall where we've started, there's the Pyrmont Bridge, which will lead you over to a charming little suburb, which once upon a time had all sorts of quarries where this very strong sandstone could be carved out and then used and polished into these magnificent structures that we will find throughout town. I'm quite fascinated with this period of Sydney's history for lots of reasons. For one thing, the Victorians were a very eccentric bunch and showed it off through all sorts of lavish language and design, not just on the buildings, but in terms of the town planning, so we will see what they produced, but also to think about the fact that in the latter part of the 19th century, Sydney had broken the shackles, literally, of being first and foremost a prison colony, having received over 80,000 prisoners from the UK transported here from 1788, and they had largely established the foundations of this portside colony, which by the 1840s had stopped receiving them altogether. But by the beginnings of the reign of Queen Victoria, things were rapidly changing in Sydney. For instance, the city of Sydney itself was incorporated in 1842. 10 years later, we're in the heat of the gold rush. Trade and communications really helped pick up Sydney's identity in the sense that it became connected across the British Empire, and there was more wealth to really spend on making the town look the part of a prosperous city. My interest in this period led me to focus on it for my master's thesis, and I really wanted to bring to life just how international Sydney suddenly became. It was attracting travellers and trade, but it also held an international exhibition for arts and industry and wares in an enormous garden palace that it built in the Botanical Gardens in 1879. This suddenly meant that Sydney was thrown into the spotlight of the world and really wanted to prove itself. It wanted to look the part of other much older and established European cities or American cities, and there was a general sense of self-awareness and pride in the urban space. It's also a very interesting time for walking tours because Sydney started to be aware that people were coming to this place and needed to be shown around. So a whole selection of guidebooks were made available. They were called Tourist Guide to Sydney or How to Spend a Week in Sydney and involved trips outside of the city, across the harbour, up to the Blue Mountains. Some of them were incredibly detailed. They walked you through every street. They had all sorts of engravings and maps and lists of all the hotels you could stay at and timetables for different types of transportation. And remember, this was 150 years ago. In many ways, and I argued this in my thesis, it kicked off Sydney's tourism industry. In fact, in the introduction to one of the Tourist Guide to Sydney handbooks from the late 1870s, it described that it felt it was fast becoming the jewel of the Pacific.